Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello everybody, Ash here from the Read This podcast, where recently we've been talking about Arthur Conan Doyle. For the last episode of the podcast, I spoke to Andrew Lycett, biographer of Conan Doyle, about The White Company, his historical novel set in the 100 Years' War. Following that episode, I released an extended interview with Andrew, which covered a range of topics connected to Conan Doyle. We talked about his globalism, his global politics. We talked about his literary ambitions beyond Sherlock Holmes. And we also talked about his spiritualism and his brushes with the paranormal. And I've since done a little sort of follow-up reading about his experiences with the paranormal. And so I wanted to share with you a little quick history of Arthur Conan Doyle and the supernatural. Andrew makes the point in the podcast that towards the end of his life, Arthur Conan Doyle had become the international ambassador of spiritualism. It's important to remember, first of all, that Conan Doyle was living in a time where there was this great scientific interest in the world of the paranormal. Believers and skeptics alike were trying to scientifically prove or disprove the existence of supernatural phenomena. Early on, Conan Doyle became interested in mesmerism or animal magnetism, named after Franz Mesmer. In fact, he wrote a horror story called The Parasite about a mesmerist, which I've just read and really enjoyed. I think it's possibly going to be a Patreon episode of the podcast. So quick plug there. But his interests went further afield than that. He experimented with telepathy, he held seances, and he went ghost hunting. There's actually there's a terrific anecdote in Martin Booth's biography of Conan Doyle called The Doctor and the Detective, in which Conan Doyle goes to a family home in Dorset on the invitation of a colonel who believes his house is haunted. Anyway, long story short, it turned out that the spiritual disturbances that this colonel was picking up on were actually the pranks of his middle-aged daughter. Prankish daughters will come back to haunt Conan Doyle later on, as we'll soon see. It wasn't until 1916 that Conan Doyle officially announced his belief in spiritualism. Now, there is this theory that before the war, Conan Doyle was much more of a skeptic and trying to debunk mediums and practitioners of supernatural performances. But then, faced with the horrors and the loss of life in the First World War, it became something that he embraced and believed in. No doubt that is true to an extent, but there are also writers such as Martin Booth who make the point that from the beginning, Conan Doyle was looking for proof in the immortality of the spirit. That's not to say that the war didn't invite a lot of new interest in the paranormal. Of course it did. There's the famous story of the angels at Mons. In fact, we've touched on this on a previous podcast in connection to Henry V, I think. Arthur Machen wrote a story called The Bowman, I believe, in which a sort of spectral apparition of the Bowman of Agincourt appeared on the Western Front and assisted the Allied troops. Slightly strange, of course, fighting alongside the French, but don't think about that too much. Arthur Machen had made this story up, but it was actually published as if it was a first-person account, and people believed it. And it grew out of control. Arthur Machen describes it sort of snowballing into something people talked about as if it really happened, and then reported it happening again on the Western Front. That's just one demonstration of how people reach towards the paranormal as a way of dealing with this hideous and unprecedented loss. And it did, affect Conan Doyle personally. His son, Arthur Allain Conan Doyle, was killed fighting in the war, and Conan Doyle claimed to have contacted him shortly after his death through a seance. Interestingly, although his son was referred to as Kingsley, his name was Arthur Allain. Allain was also the name of Conan Doyle's lead character in The White Company. Now, in terms of Conan Doyle's more famous paranormal activities, there is, of course, the Cottingly Fairies. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of the Cottingly Fairies, basically a young girl, Elsie Wright, and her cousin photographed what appeared to be fairies around their home in Cottingly, in West Yorkshire. And Arthur Conan Doyle got wind of this and was pretty convinced by these photographs. Interestingly, he took them to a fairy expert who wasn't as convinced and said the coiffures of the ladies, the fairies, are much too Parisienne. Basically, he was saying that they are noticeably stylish and fashionable in the modern sense for fairies. But Conan Doyle was convinced, and he really staked a lot of his reputation on the Cottingly Fairies turning out to be real. He was really keen to convince the rest of the world. He said, when fairies are admitted, other psychic phenomena will find a more easy acceptance. So the very outlandishness of fairies existing, he thought was actually quite a good thing. But of course, they were revealed to be fakes. Elsie Wright and her cousin had made these cutouts. I mean, the pictures are brilliant. If you look them up, they are quite convincing. I mean, if you did believe that fairies existed, you could even to this day find some of those photos quite startling. But Conan Doyle was pretty mercilessly lampooned for his believing in fairies. One magazine said, "For the true explanation of the fairy photographs, what is wanted is not a knowledge of occult phenomena, but a knowledge of children." But even after Conan Doyle had broadcasted the fact that he believed in spiritualism, he continued to take a scientific interest in it. He investigated various mediums, including Eva Carrière, a medium who had been investigated by several scientists and apparently passed muster. So she was quite well respected among her field. Among her other party tricks, she would leak ectoplasm out of her mouth, the top of her head, her tips of her fingers, her nipples, and her vagina. She was also investigated by Harry Houdini, who saw straight through her and debunked her quite quickly. Houdini and Conan Doyle actually struck up a friendship, and Houdini was really quite perplexed, understandably, that this scientist and author of Sherlock Holmes was such a devout believer in spiritualism. Somehow, Conan Doyle talked the very cynical Houdini into attending a séance in order to contact Houdini's dead mother. Conan Doyle's wife, Jean, had claimed to have seen Houdini's mother in a dream where she had been sort of wandering the afterlife carrying a crucifix. And apparently Houdini was too polite to point out the fact that, given that his mother was Jewish, it's probably unlikely that in whatever realm of the afterlife she was carrying a crucifix around. Anyway, Conan Doyle's belief in the supernatural, in spiritualism, dominated really the latter part of his life. He opened a spiritualist bookshop. He funded a spiritualist magazine called Light, and wrote several books and pamphlets about spiritualism, and did very popular lecture tours, and continued to hold seances and talk to lost family members, and even former fellow authors like Oscar Wilde, who he claimed to have spoken to across the ether. After he died, his wife Jean claimed to have been contacted by Conan Doyle, and his home was said to be haunted by Conan Doyle's ghost searching for a diary. So yes, that's just a very brief overview of his paranormal activities, as I say. To hear a little bit more about it in detail, listen to my interview with Andrew Lycett, because that's what piqued my interest, and the conversation, as I say, covers a range of other topics connected to Conan Doyle, which was really interesting to learn about. And let me know if you'd like to hear a bit more about Conan Doyle and ghosts, but also perhaps some of his horror stories, particularly The Parasite, which I really enjoyed. Anyway, that's all for today. Until next time, happy reading.